14. Corrections. Learning objectives. Explain the primary purposes and goals of corrections. Summarize the four correctional ideologies that have developed with the model each associated with. Describe the various correctional alternatives to incarceration being used in the United States. Discuss how jails differ from lockups and prisons. Compare and contrast parole and probation. Identify the correction alternatives available for juveniles and what the primary focus of juvenile correction is. So when we look at the purposes and goals of corrections, one of the things you think in terms of retribution, it's about getting even. This is really about, when you think about this philosophy, is really the old expression, an eye for an eye. So getting even with individuals, punishing them because they did something wrong. Deterrence is about basically trying to get individuals to deter them from keeping them away from crime, get them to stop doing crime. It's when you look at deterrence. Incapacitation is when they are actually incarcerated, they're locked up, or it's basically they do not have the ability to do what they used to do. And when you look at incapacitation, you think the first thing is the best example is incarceration. Rehabilitation. So you see rehabilitation, you see this is for individuals who you think they may have a drug problem or a sexual addiction problem or whatever it may be. You think there's a way that the system think there's a way that they may be rehabilitated. Recidivism and desistance. And recidivism and desistance is basically how often they're actually going in and out of the system. So when we think in terms of how often people go in and out of the system, we refer to it as repeat offenders. But we also have looked at that and said, you know what? These people are the kind of folks that you think about that no matter what you do, it seems like they always go back in. They always go back in. So the goal is to try to reduce the recidivism rate. And the desistance is when you get them to the point, but they're no longer, and this is the goal, is to get them to desistance where they're no longer committing crimes. And they've actually sustained and been, for a significant period of time, been lawful. So when we think in terms of our views about crime, we have a couple of views here we're going to take a look at, and these are conflicting views. So if we think in terms of the classical view, it focuses on crime, holds that humans have free will and are responsible for their own actions, and looking at due process. So this is basically looking at focuses on the crime. He's like, well, hey, people can stop committing crime if they want to. They choose to commit crime, and they're responsible for their own actions. You can't blame anybody else for what they do. Now, if you look at the positivist view, it focuses on the criminal, holds that humans are the product of their environment and cultural influences, criminology. So when you look at it, it's like, well, you know what? The reason he's a criminal is because of where he came from and what he went through and those other things. And it wasn't his choosing, it wasn't his fault that he became a criminal. It's because it was just how he was raised and who he was around. So you can see there's a classic conflict right there in itself of how you view, or how these two views differ. Even within the law enforcement ranks, if you talk to different people, depending upon who you talk to, you might find out what their view is slightly skewed towards. I can tell you, from my personal experience, most of the law enforcement officers, they would most likely fall in line with the classical view. Ideologies and models. So punishment and adjusted model. And this is where you see situations where it looks at like this. When people commit crimes, then we punish them. We find some kind of way to punish them. No matter what it may be, you find some kind of way to punish them. That is the justice model. The control and the custodial model, this is where you take them basically and you incarcerate them and you lock them down. And again, you're thinking in terms of traditional jails and prisons. Treatment and the medical model stuff. So we have somebody, this is actually, I've seen this myself. Some people who are actually criminals who commit criminal acts, The reason some people do it is they're not properly medicated. They may have some bad tendencies, but they might not go as far as commit crimes. And some of them, they actually go to prison and get put on medication that they actually should have been taking all along, and they no longer have criminal tendencies. So the treatment medical model can be effective for a very small percentage of people, in my personal opinion, and I've seen that where it actually has worked. The prevention and ideology and integration model is trying to find ways to prevent people from doing things, find ways to keep them engaged in the community, to do other stuff, and prevent them from going back to that type of lifestyle, and then try to re-engage them, reintegrate them back into their communities. But when you integrate them back into communities, you want to integrate them back into communities as someone who's a law-abiding citizen, no longer a criminal. The problem you have sometimes with reintegration, if they go back into the same place that they came from, the same people who are still there, so meaning, i.e., some of the criminals that they hung with. So that's one of the problems that doesn't help them if they go back to the same place where they hang with criminals. So alternatives to incarceration. So let's look at less restrictive and costly than punishment. A lot of look, when you talk about putting people in housing and jails and prisons and stuff, that's not free. Somebody's got to pay for it. And guess who that is? That's the taxpayers. We taxpayers have to pay for that. So what you look at, if there are things that you can do that might be less restrictive and less costly than actually locking somebody up, for instance, straight fines and day fines and stuff, charging them, penalizing them, and charging, and makes people have to pay. Some people that works. Forfeiture, for instance, if you got caught, say, and this is your second DWI driving, or third DWI, driving while impaired. Some states might say, on your third strike, you have to forfeit your vehicle. Restitution. Okay, if you got here and you cause damage to somebody, let's say you DWI, and you drive and you tear up somebody's front porch, now you got to pay for it. Community service. They might be told as individuals where you might have a situation like, you know what? We're not going to send you to jail, but what we are going to do is you're going to have to do community service on the weekends for the next 6 months. Intensive supervision. So when you have somebody that bottom line is they have to have somebody who's supervising them and have to have check-ins with them. Usually somebody within the community, some type of community leader or something. House arrest and electronic monitoring. This is a lot of times when they do house arrest and electronic monitoring. In many cases, it's people who would be considered kind of low risk, or low risk people, or low flight risk, a non-violent and low flight risk. Day reporting centers, where it's like, hey, they have to go and report to these centers each day. And as a result, that's kind of that's what they've been sentenced to do and they're required to do. Residential community corrections. You have some places where you have some residential facilities where it's like, I give an example where someone may be required to, he gets to go to jail, he gets to go to work every day, but every night he's got to go back to the residential community corrections and spend his nights in jail. And of course, probation. That means somebody who served out their sentence, but now they're on probation for a certain amount of time to make sure that they keep their nose clean. And doing this is when they have to check in with a probation officer periodically, get drug tested, and their activities monitored to ensure that they try not to go back into a life of crime. So incarceration jails. So these are places of confinement, detained individuals waiting to appear before court and hold their sentences up to a year or less for incarceration. So a lot of times people say, well, he went to jail for 5 years. So people don't go to jail for 5 years. These are short-term places, usually for up to about a year, and they may stay there. And a lot of times that's why they're going through legal proceedings with their case if they're going to trial. Once they get convicted, then that's when they'll be looking to remove them from jail to send them off to prison. Lockups, you have commonly located in city halls or police detention stations, or these are little small cells, usually just designed to hold somebody until you can transport them to a jail. Sometimes you may have somebody locked up. I personally have had somebody in one of these lockups You may have heard this term used, holding cell. And while you while you prepare to interview somebody or do whatever else, but it's temporary. You have temporary holding facilities for a max of 48 hours. And in some places, with some places in some states and some cities, they have these. I've never personally had anybody to go in one of those, but you would periodically, some places actually would use that. And it might be something like for somebody that might be a domestic violence abuser or something along those lines. And these places held over almost 750,000 people at the end of 2014. So you can see when you look at these kind of places, there's a lot of folks going through there who they're criminals. They're knucklehead. They're almost more knucklehead than they are criminal, but they do something that determines that they are criminals. Prisons. Now, this is where people go when they're serving convictions. They've been convicted and they're serving out their time. So this is where they will be going to prisons. They have a warden, the superintendent holds convicts, offenders sentenced to more than 1 year, maybe punitive or treatment oriented. Critical overcrowding issue as well as inward flow of contraband, assaults, rapes, prisonization, and privatization. So these are basically like little cities. A lot of times they're so big. And because you have a bunch of bad people who work in there, they do bad stuff, even while they're in prison. So you have a lot of things that's going on the streets, like the assaults, the rapes, stuff that's going on. You have you have gangs, prison gangs. So obviously you're going to have some serious problems when you got that many bad people and that type of activity going on. So parole. This is when someone is like in prison and they get parole. That basically means they didn't serve out their sentence. They got released early. And they got released early based upon some certain conditions. Some of the conditions sometimes is they must have a job. They must stay lawful. They must stay in a residence and have drug testing. They must stay with somebody that's documented with the system. For instance, they can't go stay with a criminal buddy. They may have to go stay with their mother or their father or something like that. You have pros and cons to parole. One of the cons that I see to parole sometimes is seems like they parole the wrong people. To me, some of the people seem to be high risk people, violent individuals. And unfortunately, with some states, they do force to let some bad people go out on parole because of overcrowding. So reentry and reintegration. So this is about folks coming in and out of the system and going back into their communities. Elements of successful reentry programs. So when you talk about a reentry, reentry is a statewide issue. When you're looking at the state, this is the people coming and going all across the state. So the current approach is costly. Outcomes are not great. So when they have to implement these programs, they're not cheap either. They're not free. However, they still are actually cheaper than actually keeping somebody just locked up all the time. Solutions not entirely within corrections. No, because a lot of times they have to get involved with community leaders or community programs like social workers and even probation and all these other things. So corrections can only go so far. The rest of the stuff is going to be held by other people, other professionals and community leaders. So when you look at both human services and law enforcement must join in on this, because when you're looking at these people coming back into the community, first of all, law enforcement knows them, probation knows them, and you have these human services places that could possibly work with them to try to help them find jobs or help them learn a trade or a skill or something along those lines. Communication and data sharing is essential. When you have these people come back to these communities, you do have to share information. Agencies need to share information. The human service agencies, particularly probation and law enforcement. Because if they go back into a life of crime and stuff, then probation will have most of the information on them about where they're supposed to be staying, where they're going, and whatever works. And they still have to check in with them. Success can be measured. Oh, it's easy to measure success. It's based upon how many of them repeat and come back. You look at how many people repeat and come back and how many don't. There's your success, how you measure. Death row versus life without parole. So in 2015 states, executed a total of 28 prisoners and handed down 49 death sentences. Now, one of the things about this, when you look at this is deceiving. Don't think that somebody gets a death sentence and they get executed the next week. There's some people on death row been over there 10 plus years. So there's a lot of appeals involved and a lot of different things come into it. So that's, you talking about even somebody's put on death row, you're still talking about housing these people for very, very long periods of time. And you have people who are for the death penalty, and you have people who are against it. And some people see it as, you know what, he's so evil, he's so bad, he did so many different things. There's no way to rehabilitate this monster. The best thing for him is to lock him up forever, but put him to sleep. And then you have opponents that say, you know what, the guy's in prison for killing people. Now we're going to kill him too, do exactly what we told him not to do. That's how they view it. And so they think it's immoral, and they think it's something reprehensible and something that we should not be doing. Either way, it is extremely costly and can be cruel. Here's one of the things I can tell you. Different states have different ways of executing people. Some of them will be considered a little tad bit more civil than others. So depending upon where somebody gets put on death row and gets sentenced to it, would determine the method in which the state uses. Juvenile corrections. Now, this is a big problem in this country, juvenile corrections. So when you look at it, there are 100,000 juveniles reside in detention centers each day. And this is back in about 2015 stats we're looking at. 50 to 80% of youth released from juvenile facilities are rearrested within 3 years. A lot of them are basically young criminals who will be adult criminals one day, unfortunately. And again, depending upon where they're from, where they go back to, a lot of things get factored into it. So one of the things you want to look at is have intermediate sanctions for juveniles, things that you can actually get involved with them immediately to try to dissuade them from engaging in criminal activities. Some of the things you look at, like shelters and ranches and farms and group homes, halfway houses, they need to integrate rather than be isolated. So remember, they're young, and some of them brains are not fully developed yet. Some of them may actually be able to be salvaged and saved. But if you look at this, you see shelters, ranches, and farms and group homes. What do you notice about that? It's getting them out of their community. That is extremely big. If you can get them out of their communities, some of them will have a chance. The problem is they don't go to these places and stay forever. They eventually go back home. And when they do, possibly good thing that's been done, it might get undone. Or some of them may be old enough by the time they come out of it, they're almost old enough to go out on their own and get away from home, whatever else. The need to integrate versus isolate, that's very important. To try to integrate them into positive type things, around positive people. In many cases, some of them have never been around it before. They've never seen it. It's foreign to them. Everybody they know was either unemployed, criminal, or on welfare. Residential placement, like you have like these boot camps. Those have actually been good for some people. There's actually been documentation where some people, some juveniles have gone to boot camp and did so well. And because they had juvenile records and not adult records, some of them came out, and when they turned of age, they joined the military. So that is definitely a success. So you got the aftercare after they come back. Again, how are you going to administer care to them, see after them, and make sure that things go the way they should be, monitor stuff. Focus on the reentry to the community. It's got to be getting them back. If they go back to the community, who are they going back to? Where are they staying? And who are they going to be running with? Who are going to be involved with? If it's the same old group of criminals, then there's a high probability that they will, like they said, go back. 50 to 80% of them go back into crime. A lot of times that's why. That concludes this chapter.